If there was an award for a game that's had the most discussion about it over the past decade, then Breath of the Wild may be one of the strongest contenders for that title. Before Breath of the Wild came out, Nintendo was in a bit of a slump, some might say. Now that's not to say that they're doing poorly, mind you. The Wii and DS era were massive successes, and even if the first few years of the 3DS were a bit rough, it eventually did pick up steam. Then we have the Wii U, which we all know the story of how much that console underperformed, so it was no surprise to see that in the early to mid 2010s, Nintendo was starting to hurt a little bit. Couple that with the fact that on a software front, Nintendo really didn't have much that I would consider to be system sellers at the time. There were no doubt great games from this era, such as Mario Kart 8, Smash 4, Splatoon, Mario Maker, and Mario 3D World, but even with those being great games in their own right, they didn't exactly set the world on fire enough to convince the general gaming audience that a Wii U was worth a purchase. So during this time, Nintendo just sort of stayed in their own little bubble. There was a potential saving grace for the Wii U with the next mainline 3D Zelda game being announced as far back as January 2013. Zelda, in many fans' eyes, had fallen off a little bit since the release of Twilight Princess back on the GameCube and Wii. Many of the games had stuck to handheld, which while good, weren't the universally acclaimed masterpieces that the series was known for, and Skyward Sword was seen as a very divisive title that a lot of the hardcore Zelda fans at the time begged to have the series move in a different direction from. One shining light in this era was A Link Between Worlds, a modern Zelda game that respected the tradition of older titles while also adding a fresh new spin for having a very open-ended level of progression that would actually be used as the main inspiration for the next 3D Zelda, which at the time was only known as Zelda Wii U. The game sought to be the biggest shakeup to the mainline series since Ocarina of Time back in 1998, and with a tall order such as that, the Zelda team were really shooting for the moon on this one. This saw the game be delayed several times, as it was initially planned to release in 2015 to now being pushed back to 2017, but also putting it in the prime position to be a launch title with Nintendo's next mainline console. The success story of the Nintendo Switch is something that pretty much everyone watching this video is all too familiar with. A handheld home console hybrid that saw Nintendo ramp up its third-party partnership, as well as taking big risks and innovations with their mainline IPs. Combining that with some very clever marketing and a design that harkened back to the Wii days of appealing to both casual and hardcore gaming audiences, and you had Nintendo back like they never even left. I think one of the most important parts of the Switch's success was the absolutely stacked lineup of games that came out within the first year. You had some massive third-party titles such as Skyrim, Sonic Mania, and Doom 2016, while also a great first-party lineup with the likes of Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2, and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. But the thing that everyone had their eyes on would be the game that Nintendo fans had been waiting on since the beginning of the Wii U with the release of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I am a firm believer that the Nintendo Switch would not have been nearly as successful as it was if it wasn't for Breath of the Wild being a launch title to convince a whole group of people to rejoin the Nintendo ecosystem. From the time that Breath of the Wild was officially revealed to the day of its release, this was one of the largest conversations in most gaming circles. A lot of people already had Nintendo in their rearview mirror in this era, but Breath of the Wild was generating legitimate buzz, and when it released in April of 2017, it completely exploded. Critics were calling it one of the finest games they've seen since Ocarina of Time. There were hundreds of videos being uploaded every day of secrets to discover, or hidden tech to implement, or just weird and funny moments. Basically, every corner of the internet was raving about this game at this time. I remember what it was like at launch night back in 2017. A buddy of mine and I picked up our Nintendo Switches and copies of the game from GameStop back when they actually gave a shit about midnight releases. Then we went home and played it until our bodies just couldn't stay up anymore and we needed to sleep. It was great. I can only count a handful of games that have ever done that before in the past. There was just something so different about this game compared to the other Zeldas and other open world games at the time. It felt like a total breath of fresh air, no pun intended. For the next couple of weeks, my free time was dedicated to Breath of the Wild, doing every shrine, upgrading my armor as much as possible, trying to do every side quest, until I had that final showdown with Ganon. The stories of random things I would find when exploring Hyrule would be something that I shared with many people over the years, and as time would go on, we would see other games take inspiration from Breath of the Wild. Death Stranding, Elden Ring, Genshin Impact, just to name a few, all very distinct games in their own right, but all have cited Breath of the Wild as a key influence to their gameplay structure. I still believe we're a little too close to the shoe dropping to ultimately see the full impact that Breath of the Wild has had on gaming, but suffice to say, I think that in terms of games among this era, Breath of the Wild will be one of the ones that stands the test of time the longest and has one of the largest amounts of influence. Now, that's not to say that everything Breath of the Wild has done is perfect, and in fact, there are a couple very common detractors that people often bring up that I will get into throughout this video, but the important thing to note here is that regardless of those things, Breath of the Wild still remains as one of the largest and most important games released in the past decade. The timing of this video actually lined up pretty great for me because I actually got to experience this game on the updated Switch 2 version, which I'll just say, now this is 100% the best way of experiencing Breath of the Wild if you haven't already, but this isn't without its weird Nintendo bullshit, so let's talk about the pricing first since that's kind of a weird topic. Now, if you purchased Breath of the Wild on the original Switch, then congratulations, you can still play it on your Switch 2 and it's 900p and sub 30 FPS goodness, just the way that God intended it. If you want to play with all the enhancements of the Switch 2 version, you basically have two options. If you have Nintendo's online subscription, then you already get the upgrade bundled with it, which is fine. If you don't, it'll be an additional $10. Now, I don't personally mind charging for an upgrade like that because the difference in terms of presentation and performance justify the cost to me, with the gameplay features just adding a few bells and whistles to play with. But what happens if you don't already have Breath of the Wild? Well, you can still purchase the Switch 1 version if you'd like, but you can also just buy the Switch 2 version outright. Problem with this is, this game is $70, which is more than Breath of the Wild was when it launched 8 years prior. Even worse than that, the DLC is not included in this package, you still need to purchase it. Oh, Nintendo, never change. Just kidding, please change. So what do you get with this upgrade? Well, a surprising amount actually. Most notably the performance and presentation boosts. Faster load times, 4K resolution, HDR support, a rock solid 60 FPS. These honestly make you wonder how the hell you made it through Breath of the Wild back on the Switch 1, or God help you with a Wii U in the first place. You also get an additional save file as an opportunity to experience all the new things on a fresh run. And the most wild thing that was done was the implementation of the Zelda Notes feature on the Nintendo app. Yeah, they gave a section of this app a bunch of weird little things for you to play around with. You can get a daily login bonus that gives a minor buff. You have the ability to trade items with other players like it's a Pokemon game. You have this feature that if you go to certain parts of the map, Zelda will narrate things for you, which I definitely recommend turning the volume down for because having that notification jump scare you at 3 a.m. happened to me way too many times to count. You also have this GPS feature that gives you live coverage of your position on the map. And I say live, but it's honestly closer to looking at your Uber driver on your way to pick you up with how delayed it can be. It's a nifty feature for seeing what collectibles you still need, but as I will explain a little bit later in this video, I do not recommend playing through the majority of the game like this, since I think it goes kind of against the point of Breath of the Wild in the first place. The Switch 2 version exists to make what worked in the original game shine even more, and let me tell you, with all the updated visuals and performance, Breath of the Wild is still a gorgeous game to look at. You still have some pop-in issues, and some of the shadows and grass textures can be a little blocky, but man, just the absolute vistas you can see are as stunning today as they were back in 2017. I think the art style complements the environment perfectly. The colors are vibrant and varied, making each bit of terrain feel unique. The draw distance is large enough to make out key land features from far away that are still interesting enough that it'll invite you in for a closer look. And the game does an excellent job of bringing classic Zelda locations to life with its modern interpretations. Zora's Domain is now a beautiful steppe surrounded by waterfalls. Kakariko Village has design influenced by classic Japanese architecture that calls back to the Sheikah's roots as being inspired by ninjas. And Hyrule Castle stands as a central point visible by pretty much anywhere you stand on the map. Going back to the usage of color real quick, this game makes excellent use of using color to help you identify where to go. One of my favorite examples of this being the bright orange glow of the undiscovered shrines and towers. They do a fantastic job of sticking out to alert players of where they should consider going next. The character designs, I think, are also fantastic too. This, visually speaking, is my favorite form of Link, both for how it departs from the main convention of him having his green tunic and hat, but also how it references back to older versions of Link with the sideburns of the classic games and having the more young adult proportions of Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. All the character models I think are great. The Gorons and Gerudos look as good as they ever were, and the Zora and Rito were redesigned to emphasize more of their key features. Enemy design, I think, is also really solid. I have much more of a preference for how they looked in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask personally, but they fit the art style in this game to a T, and the sheer amount of animations they have for various things really helps bring them to life. The highlight here is for sure the Guardians. These are definitely one of the top 5 most imposing Zelda enemies from their presence alone. Granted, a large part of that has to do with the audio design. Whenever these guys are nearby, they lock onto you with these lasers that just know exactly how to fill you with anxiety. It's one of the few times that Breath of the Wild actually gets a little bombastic when it comes to its audio. You are drenched in silence the majority of the time to take the sights in, with maybe the short stint of ambient music making its way in here and there. But when you find more standout areas, or one of the many pieces of civilization, you get some music that really punctuates the vibe of where you are. There are too many examples of great pieces in this game. Kakariko Village, the Temple of Time, Zora's Domain. My favorite is definitely Hyrule Castle's theme for incorporating both old renditions of Ganon's Castle and Zelda's Lullaby. I honestly think this game's OST might be some of Nintendo's finest work. No joke. Another first for the series, as long as you pretend these games don't exist, is voice acting for most of the main characters. All except Link. He's as silent as ever, and I guess technically the majority of the dialogue isn't voice and just the main cutscenes are, but hey, progress is progress. The voice acting is fine. Nothing absolutely stellar, but it definitely does up the presentation value to the story, which, speaking of the story, I'm sort of mixed on how I feel about it. Breath of the Wild takes place so far into the future of the rest of the Zelda timeline that it doesn't really matter too much what happened before it, with some even saying that it acts as a soft reboot for the series. Since we're so far into the timeline, we also see these technologically advanced devices called Guardians, as well as these massive things called Divine Beasts that are being used to fend off the next attack of Ganon. However, Ganon was aware of what Hyrule was planning and used his power to take control of the Guardians and Divine Beasts and essentially laid waste to Hyrule. This throws the Kingdom of Hyrule into complete disarray by taking over the castle, destroying the surrounding kingdom, killing the champions of the various tribes, and mortally wounding Link. This causes Zelda to step into action to try to hold Ganon back, which she does to the best of her ability for as long as she can. 100 years later, Link finds himself waking up with his memories completely erased, in a version of Hyrule that is on the brink of collapse. After getting an artifact called the Sheikah Slate and meeting with an old man who reveals himself to be the former king of Hyrule, we are tasked with rescuing Zelda and saving Hyrule as our adventure begins. It's a very simple setup. In fact, you could say it's almost like a retelling of the main events of the very first Zelda game, with obviously way more details fleshed out and added in to make it more modern and more distinct. This version of Hyrule, much like Zelda 1 or Wind Waker, takes place after the kingdom has essentially fallen, but I don't think either of those games really nails the feeling of desolation down as much as Breath of the Wild does. So many buildings are destroyed, there are these old remains of Guardians scattered everywhere, and there only exist little pockets of actual civilization. This is the first time I felt like a Zelda game actually uses its emptiness as a way to punctuate the depravity of the world, rather than just having areas be empty because of hardware limitations. The characters this go around are all pretty good too. Zelda actually has an arc that is a bit different, as she essentially has to live up to being the heir to the throne of Hyrule, but is having trouble being able to fulfill her role. I also love how in this game we actually get to see her intelligence shine a bit more through. Like, I always thought that every game showed how Ganon related to power and Link related to courage, but a lot of the time Zelda was supposed to be the holder of the Triforce of Wisdom, and she really didn't get too many opportunities to show that side of her off. Legitimately, one of the best scenes in the game is just of her nerding out over this frog. It's some fun stuff. The other characters are great too, with the champions being some of the biggest highlights. They all have their own sort of unique relationship with Link that I think really makes them a fun group to see more of, even if someone like Rivali is essentially just Falco from Star Fox. The writing throughout the game keeps that same level of Zelda humor that was established as far back as Majora's Mask, and it still shines through as bright as ever, with a few points getting some legitimate laughs out of me. And then when it comes to Ganon, I think this is honestly a very interesting interpretation of the character. This time around, he's not so much a person as he is like an idea or a force of nature. Yeah, people take his return kind of like they're preparing for a natural disaster, which, while I think is interesting, it does kind of take a bit of that back and forth that we had from earlier versions of Ganon, but this is still a cool experiment nevertheless. But speaking of experiments, remember a little earlier how I said I was sort of mixed on Breath of the Wild story? Well, my issue isn't really with any of the characters or the world building or the writing or really any of the events that happen in the story. It's more about how it's actually told. See, Breath of the Wild is the least linear Zelda game in the entire series. Now, there are a lot of gameplay connotations that come with that, and I'll get into those shortly, but from a story standpoint, this can make things a little awkward. Your main cutscenes are in the form of flashbacks that occur when Link reaches certain places on the map. Now, the 4 tribes of the Goron, Zora, Rito, and Gerudo will all essentially have the same setup of Link interacting with the tribe's chosen champion. They are more or less interchangeable and don't really do too much to the plot outside of establishing the champion's personalities and Link's relationships with them. The other flashbacks come from these points on the map that you need to line up with these matching pictures in your Sheikah slate in order to see all the events that lead up to the Calamity. Now, while I don't hate this, it can make things seem a little jarring depending on how your playthrough goes. Like, based on which direction you go and which ones of these you do or don't stumble upon, you can have Zelda completely change how she treats Link in the cutscenes, which can be a little confusing when you don't have the full context. In fact, some of the cutscenes aren't immediately obvious where they might chronologically fit upon just watching them. To the game's credit, the pictures that they do have in the photo album are in the correct order, but it's not like you're gonna know that on a first playthrough. And even then, it's very likely that you might accidentally stumble upon one when adventuring and pick it up out of order. You can go back and rewatch them all, thankfully, but I'm still not 100% on board with the way that this was structured. Granted, you do always have the option of skipping the story entirely and immediately going straight for Ganon, which, while is a fun option and interesting thing to see for speedruns, I don't know if I would ever personally want to play the game that way. All of this is definitely a side effect of the game's structure being not only the most open-ended Zelda game of all time, but also one of the most open-ended open-world games as well. And while I don't think it completely pans out story-wise, when it comes to the gameplay, that is a completely different story. There was a lot of criticism thrown at games like Skyward Sword for being overly linear to the point where the feeling of exploration was mostly sucked out, while games such as A Link Between Worlds were given high praise for allowing players the freedom to forge their own path. Nintendo really took that feedback to heart when designing Breath of the Wild, and with a lot of inspiration of the original Zelda thrown in for good measure, the Zelda team sought to make the most open-ended game that the franchise has ever seen and break many traditions that came before it. And by all accounts, they did just that. So while Breath of the Wild does give you some main quest objectives, such as freeing the Divine Beasts while completing as many shrines and side objectives as you can along your journey through Hyrule, you do have the power to essentially ignore all that and immediately head straight for Ganon with nothing but the clothes on your back and a couple of items that you find laying on the ground. That's right, you don't have to engage the story at all. You don't need to talk to any NPCs. You don't need to do any of the shrines outside of the tutorial or any of the Divine Beasts. And even getting the Master Sword is completely optional. It's because of this that everyone's playthrough of Breath of the Wild is going to be slightly different from the next. Maybe you are the type of person who just wants to do the Divine Beasts while grabbing the shrines you see along the way. Or maybe you want to go for completing as much as possible before fatigue sets in. Or perhaps this is a revisit playthrough and you want to just take out a few Divine Beasts and then fight Ganon. Or you could be doing a challenge or a speedrun where you do as little as possible. The choice is ultimately up to you in Breath of the Wild, which I think really gives the player an insane amount of trust and really gives repeat visitors something to look forward to. So with this structure in mind, what is different about this game compared to all the other 3D Zeldas? Well, let's get into the defining trait of Breath of the Wild, the open world. This is without a doubt one of the best open worlds that we've seen from any game, full stop. Now, explaining why this game's open world is as good as it is requires a little bit of context. The 7th generation of consoles is where open world games really started to blow up as huge mainstream successes. Many franchises saw some of their biggest releases during this time, from the likes of Far Cry, Elder Scrolls, Fallout, Grand Theft Auto, Assassin's Creed, Red Dead Redemption, Saints Row, you get the picture. And all these games are great, mind you, but for nearly a decade, the open world formula that was shared amongst these franchises basically didn't see much in the way of innovation. If you saw somewhere you wanted to go, it was typically because you had an icon on your compass or minimap telling you that something was there. And if you wanted to go there, you could basically just turn your brain off and travel in a straight line until you reach your next destination, which usually didn't take too long because all the open worlds were designed in such a way that you would always be relatively close to where you were going, or would have encounters where you had to contend with along the way in order to keep you engaged. Breath of the Wild really sought to change two key things from what other open world games were doing. First off, there really aren't any icons for you to follow unless you put them there yourself. Now, if you're doing a quest that gives you specific instructions on where to go, then sure, there's a quest marker on your map for you to see. However, you aren't given a filled-in map with every point of interest already highlighted for you. Instead, if you see something in the world while you're exploring and it looks interesting to you, you can go take a look, and oftentimes you'll be rewarded for your curiosity. It might be the location of a shrine to complete to increase your health or stamina, as well as unlocking a fast travel point, or maybe a small Korok challenge to let you boost how many weapons you can hold, or maybe it'll just be some loot for you to grab, or perhaps there's a side quest there, potentially an optional boss fight. You're never gonna know unless you go explore it for yourself. I remember in my first ever playthrough, I saw an island out in the distance and I thought to myself, I wonder if I can get there. Sure enough, I found a boat and a Deku Leaf nearby that let me propel myself out there, and on that island I found a unique challenge that stripped me of all my equipment, and I had to scavenge what I could find on the island while bringing 3 spheres to their respective platforms to open a shrine. The game is chocked full of stuff like this, and ultimately, Breath of the Wild allows you to make the choice on if an area you see is interesting or not, and whether you choose to pursue checking it out. If you are someone like me who has a really bad ADHD-riddled brain, you will probably set off on an adventure and almost immediately get distracted by something that you catch out of the corner of your eye or something that you can barely make out on the horizon. And when you do go check it out, maybe it's a challenge that you can complete right then and there because they're often pretty quick, or maybe it's something that you're not able to do at this time and you can create a custom icon on your map for you to come back to. This is why I mentioned earlier that I recommend against using the app on your first playthrough, since I believe the sense of discovery is one of the best aspects of Breath of the Wild that should be preserved as much as possible. Now, the second thing that Breath of the Wild saw to change was how you navigate the open world itself. While you might have a destination that you initially plan on setting out to, oftentimes getting there is far more complicated than just walking in a straight line. Traversing the environment is a key component to this game. Maybe there's a mountain in the way and you need to determine if it'll be faster to climb it or go around. Maybe there's a mighty river that you need to cross, so you'll need to either look for a bridge, a boat, or try your look at swimming. Maybe there are some powerful enemies in the way, and you'll have to choose a different route, attempt to sneak around them, or muscle your way through. This makes the player's choice have some real weight, and it's also where the real sense of progression comes from, because as Link gets more powerful, the more of these challenges he can effortlessly overcome. Take for example the many weather effects. Early on in the game, I was traveling through the mountains and I didn't have a great heat source, so I had to bounce from fireplace to fireplace while eating food just so I could get to a particular shrine. In the beginning of the game, your options are super limited. Maybe you just carry a torch in the cold areas, or maybe you brew a heat resistance potion in the warm spots long enough for you to get where you need to go. Later on, however, you'll have access to more materials for more powerful potions or pieces of clothing or weapons that negate the weather effects entirely, allowing Link to hold his own a bit better in those areas, though some weather effects such as rain can be a bit too bothersome with no direct counter. Outside of that, I think the open world is incredibly varied and interesting to navigate. You have just about every biome that you can think of, from plains, mountains, various bodies of water, deserts, tundras, jungles, volcanoes, forests, islands, each of them having their own challenges to contend with, such as some of the more harsh environments requiring certain gears or elixirs to navigate. The scale of Hyrule this time around is absolutely massive. There were a number of times that I would jump off of a high elevation and would spend nearly a minute before I would reach the ground, and even then, I would only maybe make it slightly closer to where I was going. There are of course faster methods of traversal, with fast travel to any previously visited shrine being the obvious example, or riding a horse or shield surfing being some other fun options. But even then, chances are it's going to take you a while to get where you need to go. Now, some might call this open world a bit empty because of that, and while I don't disagree that there are some spots where there isn't much going on, I personally don't mind that. In fact, I think it's to this game's benefit. Have you ever been out in the wilderness before? There's not a whole lot going on out there. Now I know, it's a video game that's supposed to be entertaining, but to me, I just sort of like taking in the sights sometimes and being given a moment of reprieve. Trust me, Breath of the Wild has no shortage of stuff to do. 5 great fairy fountains to release, 15 towers to climb to uncover the map, 18 memories to recover for the story, 42 shrine quests to open the Sheikah shrines, 76 standard side quests to complete, with some of them being surprisingly long, over 80 different pieces of armor to wear, 118 different recipes to discover from food and potions, 120 shrines to solve, nearly 400 entries into your Hyrule Compendium by taking photos of different items and enemies, and a grand total of 900 Korok seeds to find in nearly every corner of the map. Maybe there was a little Hyrule Warriors influence that seeped its way in here after all, who knows. Now, a lot of this stuff is admittedly a bit copy and paste, especially the Korok puzzles can get very samey, making the idea of 100%ing Breath of the Wild by far the most exhausting out of any of the mainline Zelda games that came before it. Granted, it seems pretty obvious here that the intention wasn't for players to do every last little thing that the game has to offer, rather than just having enough of it spread out that most players will get a good idea of what's available to them, but I digress. So Breath of the Wild really cemented itself within the pantheon of open world games, but that wasn't the only large sweeping change that was made to the Zelda formula. As I said before, this was the most innovative game in the franchise since Ocarina of Time, and while this game is still unmistakably Zelda, there are also a number of things that were also changed. When it comes to actually controlling Link, your most prevalent new abilities come right from the start, with the ability to climb nearly any surface as well as having access to the glider. With being able to climb anything that you can set your sights on, the world really opens up in a way that makes it seem like you can go anywhere you'd like. Even then, some of the more tricky areas will have required you to have upgraded your stamina to a decent degree, or be very intentional with your path, which prevents this from being an overpowered feature and instead makes it into one that requires a little bit more foresight, which I think is excellent. The glider also allows you to travel great distances at speed and safely descend from massive heights, and this is probably the single most copied thing about this game if I'm being honest. You get this immediately after completing the Great Plateau, which acts as this game's tutorial area, and this might actually be up there as one of the greatest tutorials from any game that I've ever played. The Great Plateau sets up your primary objective, teaches you all the main mechanics of the game, including stealth, combat, using the environment to your advantage, stamina management when climbing, foraging for food and materials, the new physics engine, how shrines work. The Great Plateau is essentially a mini sandbox for you to play around with in order to get a feel for the main game. It teaches you the mechanics by setting up situations and allowing you to discover them yourself, and most importantly, it gives Link his primary abilities, being the runes in the Sheikah Slate. Yeah, as another tradition broken, Link basically gets all of his main tools right from the get-go. Magnesis to move around metal objects, Stasis to freeze something in place in order to turn potential energy into kinetic energy, Cryonis to freeze water into blocks to move across, and the remote bomb to essentially take the place of the bomb item from every previous Zelda game. You can use these at your leisure, and while they can definitely be useful for making your way around Hyrule, they are essentially required for completing the many shrines and divine beasts. These are essentially a replacement for the traditional Zelda dungeons, and I've got some opinions on these. So starting off, there are 120 shrines located around Hyrule, and when completed, they will give you a spiritual orb that when you have 4 of them, can be turned in to increase your maximum health or stamina. Now, the majority of these shrines will have Link doing a puzzle that will utilize a combination of the Sheikah Slate abilities and the newly implemented physics engine to get to the end. Let me just say, these are also a big highlight of the game for me. Puzzles in 3D Zelda games, I always felt were a little bit lacking if I'm being honest, especially compared with how tricky some of the 2D entries could be. For the most part, they never really required too much thought and were more about using the right item in the right place, but these shrines really do switch things up. There are definitely a couple of shrines that you'll immediately get the answer for, but there are some other shrines that will test you on a number of things, including memory, conducting electricity, burning objects, temperature control, usage of your many abilities, and many other things. Granted, this is still Breath of the Wild, so it is certainly possible for you to cheese things if you can get creative enough. Looking at you, shrines that require the usage of the gyroscope, no way am I ever going to be doing these things legit. Now, a problem I do have with the shrines is that not every one of these is created equal. Many of the shrines will have you do the challenge inside of them, and I think those are some of the strongest in the game. Others will have you do an environmental challenge outside, and then immediately give you the reward inside. Now, I don't mind these too much since I think a lot of the environmental challenges are legitimately great, with some of the riddles that you need to solve being personal highlights for me. However, I do wish maybe we got another challenge inside of the shrine that reflected what we needed to do to get in the first place. And then there are the many shrines that just act as combat challenges, and these are just sort of whatever. It would have been nicer if it wasn't the same enemy every single time, but you know, it is what it is. The only thing that those shrines really have going for them is that if you want to get some high-end weapons early, they are super easy to exploit and defeat the enemies there, so go for it, I guess. Then we have the divine beasts. Oh boy. So depending on who you are, you might think these are the worst parts of the game or are decent distractions, albeit not a great substitution for dungeons. I fit more into that later camp. You essentially need to find 5 switches around these machines, and you can go about getting them in any order you choose. Now, something that's actually kind of interesting is in your map screen, you can alter the layout of the Divine Beast to a few different modes, but for most people, that's really not enough to save this. The puzzles are okay, and these are a decent enough spectacle, but you complete them so fast that it doesn't have the same oomph that a typical Zelda dungeon has. The rewards you get are at least worth it. Urbosa's Fury for dealing massive amounts of damage, Daruk's Shield for blocking big hits, Mipha's Grace for healing up to full, and best of all, Revali's Gale that will create a gust of wind to elevate you to higher terrain quickly. Go for this one first if you can. We do technically have a 5th dungeon in the game, being Hyrule Castle, and honestly, I think this is kind of a good medium between the two styles. You can go right to the end if you want, but exploring around will get you some really great loot. There's tons of secrets to find, and it's filled to brim with some of the most challenging enemies in the game. Which, speaking of enemies, they are honestly another point of contention for me. There's just honestly not a lot here. You have 13 different types of enemies, with some variants such as the different Guardian types and Yiga clan members maybe doing just enough to justify them being counted as separate enemies. Either way, we're talking less than 20 different foes to fight. That's a fewer number of enemies than you would run into when playing Ocarina of Time before you even become Adult Link, which is undoubtedly disappointing. There are plenty of different colored variants that do slightly mix things up, and maybe the enemies might have different weapons that they could occasionally use, but that's all you're really getting here, unfortunately. I will say the enemy AI is at least pretty damn fun to interact with. From sneaking through and stealing all of the enemy's weapons to see their reactions, to just using bananas to distract the Yiga clan members, if there is one thing I can say is that these enemies do their best to keep you on your toes. Same with bosses. Again, a very limited variety with 3 different overworld boss encounters, which, while fun, isn't really a whole lot. And then there's also the bosses within the Divine Beasts themselves that I'm not crazy about, given that I think they're aesthetically too similar to one another, and in Thunderblight Ganon's case, a little too annoying. Then, when it comes to talking about the difficulty, I think it's pretty safe to say that Breath of the Wild is definitely the most challenging 3D game that the series had seen up to that point, assuming you aren't counting something like the Master Quest version of Ocarina of Time. You will die in this game, I am sure of it, and if not from enemies hitting like trucks, then maybe by misjudging a jump and falling to your death. But more than likely, the enemies will get the best of you until you fully get into the combat, which I have to say, the fighting in this game is honestly a lot more deep than I thought it was going to be. You'll be able to parry range attacks and dodge physical attacks to perform a flurry rush that slows time down for you, and you can inflict massive damage to your foe like it's a fucking Bayonetta game. You'll also be able to switch out your weapons on the fly, and there are a ton of different ones this time around, but they mostly fit into a few different archetypes. You have your one-handed weapons like swords and clubs operating as you'd expect, spears which attack at longer range and more quickly but do less damage, two-handed weapons which deal massive damage but are slow, boomerangs which can attack like a sword. You can also have them return back to you when thrown, various elemental rods for casting magical projectiles, the Deku Leaf for creating gusts of wind, as well as different shields and bows to use. The bows also come with a bunch of different types of arrows, with the ancient arrow perhaps being one of the most disgustingly overpowered weapons that Link has ever had in any Zelda game. A lot of these weapons also have multiple uses, such as wooden weapons being able to be set on fire, which is great for lighting torches like it was a Deku Stick in earlier games, but bad when you're in a volcano and your weapon starts to disintegrate. There's other examples of this too, such as metal weapons conducting electricity, or your fire or ice weapons altering your current temperature. There's a good amount of depth here too. Each weapon also has its own durability, and when it's destroyed, it is unfortunately gone forever. This is another one of the big criticisms thrown at Breath of the Wild, since it kind of disincentivizes you from using your strong weapons in favor of using your weak ones. And while I also typically end up doing that, I don't think this is something that I would change too much personally. Breath of the Wild teaches you early on that there are often smarter ways of handling encounters rather than facing things head on. Oftentimes, if you see a large amount of enemies, you'll be encouraged to sneak around them with the new stealth mechanics, or look around the environment for a boulder to push down or an explosive to set off. If you do want to adopt a more aggressive playstyle, I will say I feel like the durability is more of an early game challenge that gets mitigated very well as you reach the end. Yes, it sucks to have your weapon that you just picked up get destroyed in 12 hits. It'd be like playing through Ocarina of Time with nothing but the Giant's Knife that breaks on you every couple of seconds. It's also a bit annoying to have to open your menu in the middle of combat just to switch to a new weapon, especially if you do that multiple times in the same encounter. However, in the endgame, when you have the Master Sword, which recharges after 10 minutes, or a maxed out inventory of weapons by collecting a bunch of Korok seeds, you will typically end up passing on weapons that you find, since you will just have too many of them. One feature that I was really surprised to see return was from Triforce Heroes of all things, and it's Link's ability to wear different armor sets. These, I think, first off, are all cosmetically very fun, but also have some real gameplay applications. Armor that increases your climbing speed, sets that give you the ability to survive in hot and cold weather, a helmet that makes you impervious to lightning strikes, a set that convinces all of the Gerudo to think that Link is a woman, on some Final Fantasy VII Cloud sneaking into Don Corneo's lair energy. There is just some fun stuff here. I pretty much stuck to the Barbarian armor set the whole game though, since it boosts your attack power, which is honestly another great way of providing some slight mitigation to the item durability mechanic. You can even upgrade these armor sets by finding these great fairy fountains and using the materials you pick up to increase their defenses. And there are a ton of materials in this game to collect too. And while I wasn't too big on this in earlier games like Phantom Hourglass or Skyward Sword, materials are so easy to come by and have so many practical uses that this was a system I just couldn't help but engage with. You can sell them to get large rupee payouts, use them to level up your armor, put them in different concoctions to see what kind of food and potions you can make for healing and ability boosting purposes. This is just another part of the game that has a striking amount of depth and experimentation. And I think those are the two key words that I would use when describing Breath of the Wild as a whole: depth and experimentation. This is a game that puts a lot of trust in the player by giving them all the necessary tools within the first hour before launching them on a 50+ hour adventure that constantly refers back to what you've already learned, while also challenging you to think of the world in new and interesting ways. I didn't even talk about the number of secrets to discover, or the side quests to complete, or the mini games you can participate in, because I think the big thing that matters most about this game is that sense of wonder and discovery that you can feel on a first playthrough, as well as reliving those moments or mixing things up on subsequent ones, and the best way to truly feel that is to just play it for yourself. I thought a good way to recap this video would be to quickly run down some of the most common criticisms that Breath of the Wild has and share my brief thoughts about them with you guys. Yes, the durability system can be a hindrance and is especially annoying in the beginning of the game. However, by the end of the game, I feel like it becomes a non-issue given how many options you have and how plentiful the amount of weapons there are for you to find. Yes, the lack of traditional dungeons is a big bummer. I think the Divine Beasts are fun for what they are, but compared to basically every other 3D dungeon, they just do not measure up. These just honestly did not fill the void left by the traditional dungeons, even if I thought something like Hyrule Castle was a happy middle ground. Yes, I think the story is told in such a way that it can be confusing unless you are deliberately going for the memories in the correct order, no doubt about that. Yes, many of the shrines are repetitive. When the shrines are good, they are a huge highlight of the game. But the amount of ones that just have you walk in and fight a guardian or immediately get your reward happen far too often. Yes, the enemy variety is very limited. The enemies that are here are very well done with some great AI, but you see pretty much all of them within the first few hours of the game, and the boss battles do leave a little bit to be desired, especially the final one. Yes, climbing can be a bit annoying, especially when it rains. I think the climbing is a core component of the game, so I would personally change nothing about it, but having no direct way of dealing with rain outside of timing your jumps or waiting for it to pass is a bit annoying. Thankfully, this was fixed in Tears of the Kingdom. Yes, the world does have some spots that are completely empty. I personally think this works to the game's benefit, and let's be real, it's not like Breath of the Wild is short on things to do, so I don't really mind this too much. Yes, having to jumble through your UI can be a bit annoying during combat. This is something we're definitely going to talk about more when it comes to Tears of the Kingdom, just you wait. And yes, this game does give pretty vague instructions sometimes and isn't always straightforward, but I feel like if it was, this game just wouldn't be Breath of the Wild. So yes, Breath of the Wild is clearly not a perfect game, and depending on what type of player you are, this could be just downright overwhelming. Do these points I just listed make Breath of the Wild a bad game though? Absolutely not. This is a game that I would consider to be a must-play. Nintendo got a lot of shit in the Wii U era for having their games be way too handholdy and treating their players like they were dumb, and to see them pivot this hard and this successfully is absolutely amazing. Now, some of you might be wondering what my thoughts were about the DLC in this game. Well, since this video took a little bit longer to get out, I thought I would do a couple of bonus videos for the DLC packs to tide you guys over until my next main Zelda video, so please look forward to those. But when it comes to this game, the amount of times that I was playing through this and I just had a stupid grin on my face after I discovered a secret or was just taken in the sights happened far too many times to count. The open world is phenomenal, the amount of stuff to do is massive, and the total trust they give you to forge your own path and play around with the mechanics is something I wish more games would do. This remains not only as one of the best designed Zelda games in my mind, but one of the best overall games in Nintendo's entire catalog. I loved this game when I played it back on launch night in 2017, and I love this game to this very day. And that is why, that without a shadow of a doubt, I can recommend that you play The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild.